Now we are going to work on the pivot roller assemblies. We demonstrate the process once, but you will need to build two. Begin by using your Allen wrench to loosen the bolt provided with the pivot nub. Remove the T-nut and set aside for later use. Seat the pivot nub on the threaded end of a 15-inch slotted beam. Thread the bolt and hand tighten. Use your Allen wrench to firmly tighten the nub in place. Next, take a 4-hole gusset and prepare it by inserting 3/4-inch hex bolts with lock washers into the two short side holes. Install T-nuts on the bolts, being sure the bump on the T-nuts face away from the gusset. Slide the T-nuts into the slotted beam using one of the channels leading to a flat side of the pivot nub. Be sure the 3-hole side of the gusset faces the pivot nub and is located approximately 1 inch from the end, as shown here. Hand tighten, then use your hand tool to firmly tighten the bolts. Prepare a second 4-hole gusset with hex bolts, lock washers, and T-nuts. Remember to face the T-nut bumps away from the gusset. Slide the T-nuts into the slotted beam using the same channel used earlier. Be sure the 3-hole side of the gusset faces away from the pivot nub and is located flush with the beam end as shown here. Notice the gussets protrude from the beam parallel to each other. Next, place a flat washer on the bolt at the base of the black adjustable fabric roller support. Thread the assembly into the threaded end of a 4 1/2-inch slotted beam. Hand tighten. Now insert 3/4-inch hex bolts with lock washers into the open holes of the 4-hole gusset mounted flush to the end of the 15-inch slotted beam. All 4 bolts should be facing in the same direction. Install T-nuts with the bumps facing away from the gusset. Orient the 4 1/2-inch slotted beam with adjustable fabric roller support attached, as shown here. Slide the 4 1/2-inch slotted beam onto the T-nuts until it seats against the 15-inch beam. Hand tighten, and then use your hand tool to firmly tighten the bolts. Note, when building the second pivot roller assembly, you will install a non-adjustable aluminum collar mount in place of the black adjustable roller support. Next, install the 3-hole pivot brackets onto the sides of the nub end. Insert a 3/8-inch shoulder bolt into the pivot hole as shown here. Apply a plastic washer over the bolt and onto the protruding shoulder. Then thread the bolt onto one side opening on the nub end and hand tighten. Repeat the process and install the second bracket on the other side of the nub end and hand tighten the shoulder bolt as before. During this next step, be sure the plastic washers have not slipped off their respective shoulders. Reposition the washers as necessary, then use your Allen wrench to firmly tighten the two bolts. Upon completion, you will have two assemblies as shown here. Now you will install the roller support assemblies onto the two side rails. Notice that the pivot roller assembly with the black adjustable roller support should be installed on the side rail that already has the black adjustable liner roller support installed. Position the assembly as shown here, so the pivot brackets are aligned on either side of the 15-inch vertical tube and the slotted beam rests on the rubber-capped hex bolt. Insert 2.5-inch hex bolts with flat washers through the brackets and the square tube. Add a flat washer and a nylon locking nut to the other ends. Hand tighten and then use your hand tools to firmly tighten these two bolts. The final step in this section is the installation of the gas spring. It looks like a small shock absorber with a bolt on the side at each end. In an earlier step, we planted a T-nut in one channel of what became the 9-inch crossbeam between the 15-inch and 34.5-inch vertical tubes on the side rail. Locate this T-nut in the channel. It must be on the same side of the rail as the 4-hole gusset which hangs down from the pivot roller assembly. If necessary, loosen the end bolts and rotate the slotted beam into its proper position. Be sure to retighten the bolts. Insert the bolt on the skinny end of the gas spring into the lower hole of the 4-hole gusset. Secure the spring in place with a nylon lock nut. Hand tighten the nut. Place a flat washer over the bolt on the fat end of the gas spring. Align the bolt with the T-nut in the slotted beam. Carefully thread and tighten the bolt using your hand tool. Note, be patient with this step. It may take several attempts before the bolt finds the threads in the T-nut. Once the fat end is tightened, use your hand tools to tighten the nut on the skinny end, firmly securing the gas spring to the 4-hole gusset. Then lower the pivot assembly. When completed, the two side rails now appear as shown here.